If you are watching the North American auto market right now, you need to pay attention because Canada just made a move that could change the rules of the game for American automakers, Canadian factories, and the entire supply chain. Washington expected pressure to force Canada into a quick concession. Instead, Canada pushed back while keeping the door open for a new agreement. Now the two sides are closer to a deal than they were days ago. But the details are where this story gets very interesting. The United States is considering lower tariffs on Canadian vehicles, while Canada is discussing changes to its own auto trade measures. At the same time, both sides are fighting over steel, aluminum, dairy, and access to American products. This is not just another trade story. This is about who controls the future of North American manufacturing, and that is why Washington is paying close attention. The Trump administration has been pushing Canada hard. The message from Washington has been simple. If Canada wants easier access to the American market, then Canada must change the way it treats American products. Canada has argued that its measures were created to protect Canadian workers and the Canadian auto industry from American tariffs. Now the two governments are trying to find a middle ground. The latest talks suggest that middle ground may finally be taking shape. The most important part of this story is the automobile industry. Cars are not built in one country anymore. A vehicle can cross the border several times before it reaches a customer. A component can be produced in Canada. Another component can come from the United States. Another can come from Mexico. The final vehicle can then be assembled in one of those countries. That means a tariff placed on one part of the system can create costs across the entire network. This is why the current negotiations matter so much. Canada has maintained a 25% tariff on certain vehicles imported from the United States. The Canadian government says those measures were introduced in response to American tariffs on Canadian vehicles. Canada has also created a remission framework designed to encourage automakers to keep production and investment inside Canada. Washington has taken a very different view. The Trump administration says Canada has treated American vehicle exports unfairly. In July, the White House announced additional duties of up to 50% on certain Canadian products under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. The administration argued that the measure was needed because Canada was discriminating against American commerce. That decision dramatically raised the pressure, but something changed. Instead of allowing the dispute to spiral into a much larger trade conflict, the two governments began moving toward a possible agreement. According to the latest reports, the United States is considering reducing tariffs on Canadian-built automobiles from 25% to 15%. The United States is also considering reducing tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from 50% to 25%. These changes have not been finalized. They are part of the negotiations that are still underway. That distinction matters. This is not yet a completed trade agreement. It is a negotiation that has suddenly become much more serious. Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc said the two countries are very close to a deal after high-level meetings in Washington, but important issues remain unresolved. One of those issues involves how Canadian content is counted in goods. Another involves exemptions for auto parts. The two countries are also negotiating over other areas of trade. So why does Canada appear to be changing its position now? The answer is pressure. Canada depends heavily on access to the American market. The United States is Canada's largest trading partner by a huge margin. Canadian factories depend on American consumers. Canadian auto plants depend on integrated supply chains. Canadian steel producers depend on industrial demand across North America. A sudden jump in tariffs could make Canadian products much more expensive in the United States. That creates a serious problem. A company can absorb higher costs for a while, but eventually those costs have to go somewhere. They can hit corporate profits, they can hit wages, they can reduce investment, or they can be passed directly to consumers. The auto industry is especially sensitive because profit margins can be tight and production systems are highly integrated. Imagine a vehicle moving through several factories. A part is made in Ontario. It moves into the United States. Another component is added. The vehicle then moves back across the border. Another stage of assembly takes place. Then the finished vehicle is shipped to a customer. Now imagine a new tariff appearing at each border crossing. The economics can change very quickly. This is why automakers have been watching these negotiations so closely. Reuters reported earlier this month that Detroit automakers were concerned that proposed changes to North American trade rules could increase costs by billions of dollars each year. The proposed changes include higher American content requirements for vehicles and changes to the rules needed to qualify for lower tariffs. That tells us something important. Even if a trade agreement is reached, the auto industry may not immediately return to normal. The rules themselves could change. And when rules change, companies must change factories. They may change suppliers. They may change where they source materials. They may change where vehicles are assembled. They may even change where they invest billions of dollars. That is the bigger story behind the headlines. This is not simply about tariffs. It is about industrial strategy. Canada wants to protect its manufacturing base. The United States wants more production inside America. Mexico wants to remain a critical part of the North American supply chain. Automakers want lower costs and predictable rules. Those goals overlap in some areas, but they also collide in others. Canada has already announced a broader automotive strategy designed to protect jobs and strengthen vehicle production. The Canadian government says its strategy focuses on investment, workforce protection, electrification, and the future competitiveness of the Canadian auto sector. That is a major clue. Canada does not want to simply become a market for American vehicles. Canada wants to remain a manufacturing center. That means Canadian officials have a strong incentive to protect domestic factories while negotiating with Washington. At the same time, the United States has its own priorities. The Trump administration wants more manufacturing inside the country. It wants American workers to benefit from industrial investment. It wants foreign companies to build more factories in the United States. And it wants trading partners to reduce barriers against American products. The auto sector sits directly in the middle of all those goals. That is why the negotiations have become so intense. Now consider what happens if the proposed auto tariff reduction becomes part of a final agreement. A reduction from 25% to 15% would not eliminate trade barriers, but it would materially change the economics. A vehicle that faces a lower tariff can become more competitive. An automaker may have more flexibility on pricing, suppliers may face less pressure, and investment decisions may become easier. But there is another side to this. If the new agreement requires more American content, then companies may need to restructure their supply chains. That could mean more American steel, more American components, more American manufacturing. It could also mean higher costs in some areas. This is where Washington may believe it has achieved something important even while reducing some tariffs. The goal is not necessarily to eliminate every barrier. The goal is to reshape the structure of the industry. That is why this story deserves more attention. The headline may say Canada and the United States are close to a trade deal. But underneath that headline is a much larger question. Where will the next generation of North American vehicles actually be built? The answer could influence jobs across several states and provinces. It could influence billions of dollars in investment. It could influence steel demand. It could influence aluminum demand. It could influence battery production. It could influence electric vehicle manufacturing. And it could influence the future of the North American supply chain. There is another reason this matters. The global auto industry is already going through a major transformation. Electric vehicles are changing the supply chain. Batteries require different materials. Software is becoming more important. Semiconductors are critical. Charging infrastructure is expanding. Automakers are competing with companies from China. Governments are using industrial policy to attract factories. So trade policy is no longer just about moving finished cars across borders. It is about controlling the industries that build the technologies of the future. Canada understands that. The United States understands that, and Mexico understands that. That is why the current negotiations are so important. Now let's look at the political side. President Trump has repeatedly used tariffs as a negotiating tool. Canada has responded with its own measures. This created a cycle of pressure. Washington increases tariffs. Canada responds. American exporters complain. Canadian exporters complain. Automakers face uncertainty. Investors become nervous. Then negotiations restart. That cycle creates a major problem for businesses. Businesses can handle high costs. What they struggle with is uncertainty. If a company knows that a tariff will be 15% for the next 5 years, it can plan. If it knows the tariff could be 15% next month and 50% after another political announcement, it becomes much harder to make a long-term investment decision. Factories are expensive, supply chains are expensive, New vehicle platforms can take years to develop. That means companies need stable rules. This is one reason why the latest progress is so significant. The two sides appear to be trying to create a framework that businesses can actually work with, but there are still major risks. One risk is that the negotiations break down. Another risk is that the two countries agree on tariffs but disagree on rules of origin. Another risk is that political pressure creates a new dispute. Another risk is that other industries become part of the negotiations. And another risk is that the eventual agreement becomes so complicated that businesses still struggle to understand how it will work. The market is watching all of this. Currency traders are watching the Canadian dollar. Bond markets are watching inflation risks. Investors are watching automaker earnings. Commodity markets are watching steel and aluminum demand. And consumers are watching vehicle prices. This is why a Canada auto agreement can have effects far beyond the auto industry. Trade policy can influence inflation. Tariffs can increase production costs. Higher production costs can push prices higher. Higher prices can influence central bank policy. And central bank policy can influence interest rates and currencies. That means a trade agreement can eventually affect financial markets. It can affect business confidence. It can affect investment. It can affect economic growth. It can even influence the outlook for precious metals. For investors who follow gold and silver, this is worth watching. Trade tensions can create uncertainty. Uncertainty can support demand for defensive assets, but stronger economic growth can have the opposite effect. If a trade agreement reduces uncertainty, then investors may move toward riskier assets. If negotiations collapse, then markets may quickly price in more economic risk. This is why the next few days could be important. The latest reports say the United States and Canada are very close to an agreement, but the final details still matter, and there is a deadline hanging over the process. The Trump administration had planned new 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. Those tariffs were delayed for 3 days after progress was reported in the negotiations. That delay tells us something. Washington wants leverage, but Washington also wants a deal. Canada wants relief from tariffs, but Canada also wants to protect its domestic industries. That creates the foundation for compromise. The most interesting part is that both sides now have something to lose. The United States does not want a major disruption in its auto supply chain. Canada does not want a major disruption in its export economy. Automakers do not want another shock to production costs. Consumers do not want higher vehicle prices. Workers do not want factories closing. Investors do not want another wave of uncertainty. That creates a powerful incentive to reach an agreement. But do not assume that means everything will suddenly become easy. Even a successful deal could create winners and losers. Some American suppliers may benefit from stronger domestic content requirements. Some Canadian manufacturers may benefit from lower tariffs. Some companies may face higher costs because they must change their sourcing. Some consumers may benefit from lower trade costs. Others may still face higher prices because of new rules. That is the reality of trade policy. There is rarely one simple winner. The bigger question is whether the new framework makes North American manufacturing more competitive against the rest of the world. That is the test. If the United States and Canada can create a stable system, then companies may be willing to invest more. If Mexico remains integrated into the system, then North America could become an even stronger manufacturing platform. But if trade disputes continue every few months, then companies may look elsewhere. Capital does not like uncertainty. Factories follow capital, jobs follow factories. That is why this negotiation matters. Now think about what happens if the final agreement lowers auto tariffs while increasing North American content requirements. That could create a very different auto industry over the next several years. More components could be sourced within North America. More manufacturing could move closer to final assembly. Companies could invest in regional suppliers. American steel demand could rise. Canadian manufacturing could remain important. Mexican production could remain competitive, and the entire region could become more self-contained. That could be exactly what policymakers want, but it comes with a cost. Building a more regional supply chain can be more expensive than sourcing from the cheapest supplier anywhere in the world. The question is whether governments are willing to pay that premium for resilience. The pandemic showed how fragile global supply chains can become. Geopolitical tensions have added another layer. Now trade policy is pushing companies to think about security as well as cost. That is a major change. For decades, the basic question was simple: where can we build this product at the lowest cost? Now the question is different. Where can we build this product at an acceptable cost while keeping the supply chain secure? That shift could reshape manufacturing for years, and Canada is right in the center of it. So when you hear that Canada just changed the auto deal, do not focus only on the tariff number. Look at the structure, look at the rules of origin, look at investment requirements, look at steel, look at aluminum, look at batteries, look at electric vehicles, look at cross-border parts, look at what companies are saying about future factories. Those details will tell you where the industry is going. The next major signal will be the final agreement. If Washington and Ottawa announce a clear framework with lower auto tariffs, then markets could view that as a major de-escalation. If the agreement also creates predictable rules for manufacturers, then the reaction could be even stronger. But if the two sides fail to finalize the deal, then the market could quickly return to uncertainty. That is why this story is not finished. It may actually be entering its most important stage. Canada has shown that it is willing to negotiate. Washington has shown that it is willing to use tariffs as leverage. Now both sides must decide how much they are willing to give up. And that decision could shape North American manufacturing for the next decade. For investors, the lesson is simple. Do not watch only the headline. Watch the details. Watch the tariff rates. Watch the rules of origin. Watch factory investment. Watch auto production. Watch steel and aluminum. Watch the Canadian dollar. Watch American economic data. And watch how businesses respond. Because the real impact of this deal will not appear in one political announcement. It will appear gradually through factory decisions, supplier contracts, vehicle prices, employment, investment, and production. That is where the real story will be written. Right now, the biggest signal is that Washington and Canada appear closer to a compromise than they were just days ago, but no one should treat the deal as final until the documents are completed and the terms are confirmed. And that is exactly why this moment is so important. Canada wanted to protect its auto industry. Washington wanted to force changes in Canada's trade policies. The result may be something neither side originally planned. A new North American auto framework, one that could reduce some tariffs, increase regional production, change supply chains, and redefine how the United States and Canada compete in the global auto industry. The next move will tell us whether this becomes a lasting agreement or simply another temporary pause in a much larger trade battle. For now, the pressure is still on, the negotiations are still moving, the auto industry is still watching, and Washington is still waiting for the final answer from Canada. If you want to understand what this means for the economy markets and the future of North American manufacturing, then stay focused on the next announcement, because this story is moving quickly. If you found this analysis useful, then make sure you like this video and subscribe to Silver and Gold Watch. We follow the biggest economic developments and explain what they could mean for markets and investors. And I want to hear from you. Do you think Canada and the United States will reach a lasting auto agreement? Or do you think another tariff fight is coming? Leave your prediction in the comments. Your opinion could be very different from what happens next, and that is exactly what makes markets and trade so interesting.